Our guests are live. Welcome, everyone. Once again, this is the African Governance Institute for Development, and we're pleased to be having the April edition of our webinar. And tonight, we'll be having very, very interesting conversations on trust, on open government, on transparency and accountability. This is something that has been a trend we have seen in recent times where there seems to be a declining trust with government. People trust their military, they trust other institutions more than they trust their government. And we'll certainly be deep diving into that conversation with our guests tonight. Once again, thank you for joining us. And wherever you are joining from, please feel free to type it in the chat box. Good evening, everyone. It's good to have you. Please let us know where you are joining from. This is the African Governance Institute for Development, and this is April webinar. Every month over the last 5 months, we have been speaking on different values, governance values. Last month, we had a conversation on engaging government, protest work, and it was an interesting conversation because a lot of people believe when they have challenges with government, the first thing to do is protest. We had very insightful conversations with our guests. Before then, we had our guest in the month of February. Our guest was from Côte d'Ivoire, Professor Desiree Y, and we spoke extensively about government structures, understanding structures, and coming from a francophone country, it was able to help us see how governments work in Côte d'Ivoire. And I was also able to share federal system of government in Nigeria, and it was certainly one that you want to go back to our YouTube page to check out and certainly learn one or two things. It's so interesting just to see how close we are geographically, but how diverse and how different we can be. And tonight we will be talking a little bit more, this time on transparency and accountability, and we're looking at how to become more transparent, to share more information, and if that has anything to building trust with government. I have some statistics that I saw before I came online. I was going through the Elderman Trust Index, and there are some stats that I thought were interesting, and I'm sure we will dive into this a little as we go on. China has 79% trust in its government in 2024. In 2023, 83% of the Chinese trust their government. India, 76% of Indians trust their government. In the United Arab Emirates, 74% of them trust their government. In Indonesia, 73% trust their government. I'm sure you're probably wondering where Nigeria comes in this equation. Interestingly, Nigeria in 2023, only 56% trust the government, and it seems there seems to be a little increase as at 2024, 61%. And what does this really mean? Well, it means something when you find out that UK in the United Kingdom in 2024, according to the Elderman Trust Index, has only 39% trust in its government and 43% as of last year. I thought I found those figures quite intriguing, so I decided to look through another resource called Statista. And again, China in this report has 85% trust in its government. Saudi Arabia has 86% trust in its government. The United Arab Emirates has 84% trust in its government. Our dear Nigeria has 42% trust as at 2023. But it seems the global average just seems to be right about 51% trust in their government. But again, I'll let you know that the UK has 30% trust in its government, and the USA has 40% trust in its government. South Africans have 29% trust in their government, and Argentina has 21% trust in their government. What is very interesting is the fact that the countries you wouldn't call democracies, so to speak, seem to have higher trust in their government. They seem to have economic development, And maybe people will argue is the lack of a critical press, perhaps. But what the figures are showing is that they trust their government, while some of our other democracies that are supposed to be leaders in the democratic values seem to not be displaying as high a trust index as you may have expected. But I just put this stats out there for our information. I'm sure we will revert back to it at some point during this conversation. I saw Representative Tolu Akande come into the room, and we're waiting for her to come back in, and I think she's just doing that right about now. Honorable Representative Tolu Akande, good evening. It's good to see you.
Good evening. Good evening, everybody. I had a bit of an internet hitch there.
Well, we're glad to have you online. And
thank you for having me.
Start this conversation right about now. Once again, welcome all our guests from around the world. All right, so straight away, I want us to get into this conversation. I was reading before you came on the statistics I saw online from different bodies, of different countries, from two different sources. The Elderman Trust Index, which rated countries like India, China, UAE, Saudi, not your conventional democratic countries, with very high trust index, and those that we want to be the leaders with very lower trust index, probably lower than the global averages. And it does make me start with this question. Is transparency and accountability what leads to trust, or is it just we live in a world where people don't trust anyone, let alone their governments anymore? I'll start with Councillor Biyi Oloko.
Good evening. My name is Biyi Oloko, Councillor Biyi Oloko. For effects, if you like, I'm a councillor in the UK, West Berkshire. When you come out of Heathrow and you're those who come into London, you turn left. Instead of coming to London, you turn left, and that brings you to Berkshire, and then West Berkshire. I think Honorable Tolu Akande knows that route very well. And yeah, and I represent a ward called Title South and Holybrook, which has about 7,000 households, 7,000 residents. And in West Berkshire, we have an annual budget of somewhere between, I think it's about £170 million, 2/3 of which is spent primarily on adult and social health care. And in a previous life, I was also a colleague of both Honorable Tolu Akande and Honorable Seyi Adisa, a gem of a blessed memory. I'm delighted to be here to be able to share my insights. I hope you find it useful. Statistics you reeled out was quite interesting, but I'm not surprised. The high representation or the high trust correlates with a particular style of government. So I wonder if you can read any significance into that. But in the UK, I'm not surprised to see that low level of trust, because the ruling party is going through what I call a very challenging period, and there really is little trust in that government as it is. And those who follow UK politics would realize that the opposition party, which is the Labour Party, is favored to win the elections that are likely to happen sometime this year. So I'm not surprised to see that statistic. But again, it talks to transparency. And I guess you see an inverse relationship between the level of transparency, because in the UK, there is a high level of transparency, but you see a low level of trust. So we can read into that whatever we like, but I think that in itself, the ability to be so transparent and yet have such low level of trust perhaps indicates that if you give people too much information, then they just don't look at it, I think, at the end of the day, because they take it for granted. And I'll stop there and allow you, Seyi, to dive in again, because I can go on about that.
I think that is very interesting point you made there. You said the higher the level of transparency, the lower the trust, which perhaps is saying that in countries that they are not necessarily democracies, they don't have that level of transparency. And so see no evil, hear no evil. We just believe. We just believe what government is doing. Okay, all right. Representative.
And then you also have to test. You also have to test the source of your data. So
that's why I use two sets of data. So I use two different sets. So one witness may not be enough. I used two, and I mean obviously the figures were different, but they were in the same region. So, but we'll come back to that. Representative Tolu Akande Sadipe, it's good to have you online. I just do a little introduction, and then let's talk about that trust and transparency. Are they brothers and sisters, or?
Okay, like you said, my name is Honorable Tolu Akande Sadipe. I represent Oluyole Federal Constituency in Oyo State. Oluyole Federal Constituency is one of the oldest local governments in Oyo State, and practically a lot of families in the Kudeti area of Ibadan are from Oluyole. So in Ibadan City, my family house is in Kudeti, and the village is in Oluyole. That's how come I happen to represent from Oluyole Federal Constituency. I'm a two-time member of the House of Rep. This is my second term. And let's go to TNT, transparency and trust. You know, to me, I just think we like talking a lot of stuff about theories and all. But the reality is this. Do people trust their government? Why do people trust their government? Is the government transparent? If the government is not transparent, why is the government not transparent? Then again, can the government itself trust the people? Because I think the government and the people relationship is a two-way relationship. And the day we stop looking at it as a two-way relationship is the day we begin to continue to make the mistakes we've been making. What is a government? A government is made up of the people of the nation. So, who makes up the government? You and I, and every single man on the street. Because tomorrow, it may not be me, it may be somebody else. But the things I do while I'm in office is what will determine whether people are going to trust me. And how people see, that is the transparency aspect, what I do. Do I hide things? Am I visible to all? Are my actions legitimate? You know, so when we talk about TNT, we need to categorize it and state it clearly. What exactly are we talking about? Because government is very broad. You know, I'm trying to summarize what I'm trying to say as best as possible. And when you ask me more direct questions, I will now focus on each area. But then again, government, like any country, is a piece of paper. What gives it life and makes it real are again you and I. So we determine whether there's tea and whether there's tea. Am I making sense?
Absolutely. Absolutely. And don't worry, we'll get into the deep questions.
Please, what's TNT?
Trust and transparency. I put it together.
Oh, right.
I hope I'm correct. Okay, so there's a school of thought that, look, you elected us into office. Let us get on with the work. Why must we keep answering to every knock and every, if you like, media post? The very fact that you elected us into office presupposes that you trust us at least, and we should get on with our work. And that is a school of thought I have heard from maybe a certain generation more than the other, but there's a sense of we can't keep responding to everything the media is saying. Let us get into the work. And there's this other school of thought that, look, before you do anything, you need to communicate, you need to engage us, we need to know everything that you're doing. And so maybe it's a style thing, maybe it's a generation thing. But for me, maybe the question there is, how would you, Honorable Sadipe, and I have one or two examples I'm also going to go on to, how do you see this? You used some very strong terms in terms of, does government trust its people? And then people start asking, What do you mean does the government trust its people? You are the one with the power. It's you that needs to display trust, not we that don't have the power. We don't need to display trust. You are the one with power. We gave you the power. We put you there, and so you ought to account to us. So I want you to just speak about these schools of thought. Which do you subscribe to? Are you really from that school of thought that, look, we really need to get, there's so much to do in government, there's a lot of work we need to be doing, rather than having to explain to everybody every single thing we're doing, which sometimes is endless? Or do you come from that school of thoughts that, look, we have to really communicate everything we're having with the people?
Okay, I'm going to use a recent example to illustrate that question. I am of the school of thought that you need to let your people know what you're doing. Because when your people know what they're doing, they'll understand you better. Okay. Recently, or I wouldn't say recently, this happened last year, the federal government, president of the nation, came out and said, our people are hungry. We're going to make food available to our people. One of the items was rice. So rice is going to be made available through each representative of each local government. As soon as that was done, because of the red tape and the bureaucracy in the process, the contractors who were assigned the job by the ministries, or actually it was one ministry, Ministry of Agric, did not get their letters in time. In the process, the price of rice moved from, I think it was like 36,000 to like 80,000 by the time they finished the paperwork. I immediately went out and I told my people, this is what is happening. Rice is being delayed because the contractors are wary because they have letters at a particular price and rice has gone to a much higher price. If I hadn't done that upfront, by the time my opposition came out and said the rice from our local government was delayed because I had stolen the rice and I had gone to sell it. If I had not been transparent, my people would not have believed me if I said it after the fact. But because I was transparent, by the time the opposition came up with their stories, guess what? They failed. So I am an advocate for transparency. But then again, on the other hand, on a lighter note, transparency gets you into trouble too. One early morning, maybe about 2 a.m. in the morning, I got a call from my constituency. And I took the call because I would always take the calls. And I said to the person, in my language, which is Yoruba, I said, it is late. My husband is sleeping. Let me call you back. And I immediately got up, went to another room, and called back. But do you know that that sentence, my transparency, was used against me just before the last election? I went to a leaders' meeting and I was told that I was not fit to be a representative because I said my husband was sick. That came from a man in a patriarchal society where we're supposed to respect our husbands. I was used against me that I said my husband, the head of my household, was sick. So you can never win. You just have to give it your best. You can never win. So I hope my examples were up.
Yes. Interesting point, and I'll go back to that a little later in terms of, you know, even generations. I'm sure that was probably maybe an older person, not a Gen Z or a younger person, but I'll go into that later. Councillor Oloko, you worked in Nigeria as special advisor to the late Governor Abiola Ajimobi, and so you understand government in Nigeria, because a lot of people will be wondering, why are we bringing a councillor from the UK? But he has Nigerian experience, African experience. And now you're in a totally different system where we've seen things like parliamentary expenses scandal and all of these things that you even wonder how they come out. So I want you to take us through what is the difference in terms of the level of transparency. Why do you think, or is it better based you having experienced both? Why do you think so, if you think so? And then should we be planning to become more transparent as Nigeria as a nation and Africans? Does it lead to better governance in your opinion? And how do we make things more transparent if you go along those lines? And if you go otherwise, maybe you feel, having seen both systems, maybe we need to just stay as we are in Nigeria, you could obviously also say that.
Thank you very much for that. I'll answer it. I'll comment this way and say that you have to think about horses for courses. That means that you have to think about the environment, you have to look at your culture, you have to look at your traditions, your beliefs, and you also have to look at the level of maturity. Trying to compare the UK with Nigeria, different stages of democracy, different levels of maturity, you're not comparing like with like. The systems, the technology that's available, the infrastructure that is available is not the same. So I think you have to, you have to take a bit of that into account. Let me give you a true story in terms of when you talk about trust and transparency. At my first election, we had 2 polling booths, right? And when you talk about trust, transparency, we had 2 polling booths. And this was my first election, the first time I came through. The votes will be collated at the collation center, and then 2 polling booths where people go and vote. So I was asking my colleagues about who is monitoring the other booth. That is it likely that they're going to, tamper with the voting boxes? I was more concerned about tampering with the voting boxes. And my colleagues looked at me and laughed and like, why would you think that? No, don't worry about it. Things like that. That's the least of your worries. But somebody needs to monitor them as they're bringing the ballot boxes from one place to the other. And they were looking at me like, what are you talking about? So when you talk about trust and transparency, they had no doubt in their mind that nothing was going to happen to the ballot boxes. So, and that begins to give you a level of understanding of where we are here and where Nigeria is, because that can never happen in Nigeria, where you will allow the ballot boxes to travel independently without being monitored by all the various representatives of the parties. So when you talk about trust and transparency, we are different places. And I think we just have to take that into account in terms of, well, you have a lot of data. Here you talked about parliamentary expenses and all that. It's because the data is available. If you recall, one of the things our late boss used to tell us that a good leader doesn't take you where you want to go, it takes you where you ought to go. Now, if you take somewhere like China, China has transformed from being one of the poorest countries to being, if not the top 2, in our lifetime. Now, transparency and trust means different things out there. There's a lot of technology being used in terms of accessing citizen information, but still they have a high level of trust because that country has created a very strong middle class, regardless of how they've gotten about it. So people in that respect have a different view. Now, if you come to our environment where we're probably one of the poorest in terms of numbers, there's a lot of poor people in Nigeria. If we look at Nigeria specifically, you will not be surprised that there's of the correlation between trust. And just to pick on the example of what Honorable Tolu talked about the rice thing, because that's where they are. I don't subscribe to either school. I think you have to look at each situation and assess them on their own merits. What will obtain in the UK may not be what will obtain in China, may not be what will obtain in Nigeria. In terms of transparency, it means different things in different places. I've never been to China, but you see the pictures. There's a lot of cameras everywhere. So is there transparency? Well, there's a lot of data being collected on people and who has access to it. And when you come to places like Nigeria, the level of infrastructure is not even sufficient enough to be able to allow technology to be used, systems to be used to gather or even provide the resources that is required so we can have access to such data. In the UK, you have freedom of information, you have subject access request. If you and I have a conversation, if an officer, you write to me, I have the right to write back to you to tell you to give me a record of all the conversation that we've had. And you have to provide it, because if you don't provide it, you break the law. Now, even notwithstanding that, you still have a very low trust in government. So what that says is that the more information you give, the more critical people can become. And that's what you expect. But the other side of that is that you have to therefore make sure that you are doing the right thing, because when you provide information and you're not doing the right thing, people hold you to account. And you talk about being elected. You are elected and therefore you are accountable for being elected. So it is right that people should be able to question you, because you are there to represent their interest, not your interest, but their interest. So accountability is very important. And if your people trust you, then by deduction, you will trust your people, because it's a two-way street. So there has to be a very strong element of accountability. Now, if you're not that accountable, then that begins to call into question lack of trust. Because, if I even bring it down to a simple relationship, in a home between husband and wife, in some cases, they say if you let them know too much, then, you can be held accountable. There's a Yoruba saying, which translates, and I'll translate, say, which means if you search for too much data, you may see you may see the data, you may not necessarily like what it's telling you. So it has its pros, it has its cons, but it has to be looked at in the context of the environment in which it's operating.
Very well said. You've answered one of the questions, the Councillor Biyi Oloko. What I heard you say, and probably very correct based on those stats I read at the start of this show, is that the more info, the more critical people can be, the less trust. Now, the question I have is, the country we are in, Nigeria, would we say there is enough info out there and the trust is still not the highest? So is it Nigeria bucking the trend? You have those with probably lower information but higher trust, and then you have those with high information and lower trust. But then Nigeria doesn't exactly have high information, but then the trust is still not there. And the second question I asked earlier on is that, are there some principles that, yes, obviously different contexts, different personalities, different cultures, different leaders, and the use of their agency and all of that. But are there things we should be aspiring, or principles or values that are probably best practices that even African nations ought to take a cue from and probably imbibe? I think that was the second part of the second leg of the question that I want you to touch on. So yes, obviously everyone's different, but are there more? Please go ahead, Councillor.
Okay, now the interesting thing about Nigeria is Nigeria is quite a complex country. I can't remember the number, but you have a very high number of tribes. So you have people from different backgrounds. In the UK, as an example, you have principally three groups: English, Scottish, Welsh, and then of course maybe not Northern Ireland. But in Nigeria, just in the West alone, you have Yoruba, Igbo, even within Yoruba. So it's a very complex structure to administer or to govern. So should we stay as we are? Well, the answer to that is no, without a doubt. We need to do a lot more. There's a very high rate of poverty which needs to be addressed. So I think we need to do a lot more. Now, I would like to keep comparing to the UK because I haven't seen both examples, and I would say that in principle there's no difference in terms of that the rules exist, the procedures, the policy, the regulation, the constitution, the fundamentals exist. The challenge is in execution. Now, we look at ourselves and you think, what level of trust do we have? So I come back to the complexity of the country. Yoruba versus Igbo, Igbo versus Hausa, Hausa versus Ibibio. Shekiri versus Ijo, so all those things you need to be balanced out. And we have a very strong ethnicity, very strong let me say very, very strong tribal makeup within the country. So we need to find a way. I'll probably say we probably, well, that's different because America is almost like, again, religion also plays quite a big part in putting all of this together. Because of the Christian, Muslim, Nigeria is like almost like 50-50. So the complexities make it quite difficult. But coming back to your answer, which you're saying, look, do we stay as we are? Well, the short answer to that is no. Nigeria can't stay as it is. But what is the way forward? It's got to be a combination of what I call total democracy versus not total democracy. Because you need to take people to where they ought to go to. If somebody sees, it's like if you're starting a business, initially it's an idea, but as things begin to materialize and people begin to see it, now they understand it. But somebody is given the vision. Somebody was given a vision for Singapore. Somebody was given a vision for China. Somebody was given for a vision for Nigeria. Somebody was given a vision for the West back in the day. So again, you have to come back to what was the visionaire's vision, if you like. What did they see and what were they aspiring for? And so I guess what I'm trying to say as well is that it's quite difficult to say bring that back, but I think you still, I come back to what I said before about horses for courses. The complexity of the country therefore means we have to come up with what addresses that need.
Honorable Tolu, Akande, you spoke earlier on about the challenges, inherent in this work you do. And I'm going to ask you about challenges that you face. But it's interesting to note that we had a vox pop in the University of Ibadan just earlier on this week, just to ask if people, trust the government. And as you can imagine, most of them said they did not trust the government. In fact, probably all of them said they didn't trust. But when we asked how many of you have actually asked for any information from government, none of them had asked. So there was almost like, well, we just don't trust them. But you never even interfaced with the government, so to say. You never requested any law. You never tried. And then the question that came to my mind is, this whole what people have been saying and people just take it on, and most of them were probably the Gen Z generation, and there's this sense of this is not how we think it should be. So let me go to you, Honorable Sadipe. What challenges do government officials face, like yourself, when you are trying to be transparent and accountable? You're trying to run an open government. You want to show, open engagement, open services. You want to show data. You want to show all of these things. But clearly you're facing challenges. How have you overcome them? How are you going through them? Because you have lawmakers like yourself that want to be open, that want to be transparent, want to be accountable, but yet you're having a tough time and so how are you handling this? Because if you are trying and you're meeting this pushback, some people will say there's no point trying, let's just keep everything quiet and we don't need to share anything. All right.
You're very right about the last few statements you made. Sometimes I get that feeling myself, that why am I trying? What's the point? Because in spite of me putting all that information out there, nobody believes it. When I say that this is what I have done, this is what I have done, and this is where I have done it. And then people still come up to me, like during the last election, I called a few people up and I was campaigning over the phone and I introduced myself. They asked me what have I done? And I said, in this area, I have done this, I have done that. And the person told me, point blank, you're lying. And then I said, why do you think I'm lying? And the person goes, because you're a politician. And I said, oh, really? So politicians lie. I said, okay, now, can you do me a favor? Everything I have said to you this afternoon, could you please go out there and verify? I have a transformer in social place, in social place, in social place that I help facilitate. I have schools in social place. Do you know? And I told the guy, I said, I will call you back in 2 days' time. Please go out there and verify. When I called back in 2 days, he was telling me he hasn't had time to do it. So I said, you see, you say government is bad. And now you have somebody who is in government, who is telling you I've done this, being transparent. And then you're saying you don't trust me. And I'm saying, okay, go to so and so places so you can verify what I have said to you. So you can now decide whether you're still not going to trust me or you're going to trust me. Thereafter, every time I call back, this person never picked up their phone. Then I'll say something again. There's a lot of information on the internet.
Yeah.
If we really genuinely want to prove that your government is doing what they say they are doing or is not doing it, you can verify on the internet. There's also independent data about your government on the internet. You can go there too and find out and get your answers. Because see, if I'm your government and I'm telling you I've done this and you don't believe me, you can verify what I have done through independent verifications from independent sources. But the problem that has happened is there's a major distrust. And that distrust goes back a long way in history. So it has formed a bias from the citizens of a nation for the government of the nation. They no longer see it as a partnership. They see it as them against us. But if the citizenry will just take a step back and begin to verify, I'm sure we will begin to grow. And the distance will not be further apart, but grow closer together. And then we'll be able to decipher those who are genuinely transparent from those who are not. But the problem is, I wouldn't use the word lazy to describe my people. But I would say people have gotten lazy and they rather believe hearsay. They believe sensational news. Where someone appears somewhere and goes, those people, they didn't do that, blah, blah, blah. But then there's the information for you to verify, but you're quick to believe that local gossip.
Yes. So let me hold you there. And the question then is it a communication gap? Because like I just shared, we have younger people in the university. They've never even tried to approach government, but they don't even trust the government. And there is research that says younger people trust their own networks. They don't trust government. They trust their own networks. And so is there a way to effectively communicate? I ask people, government is not doing this. Have you heard of Empower? No. Have you heard of Shopee? No. Have you heard of this? No. Have you heard of that? And I'm like, I don't get it. It's everywhere. But then maybe it's everywhere except where the young people are gathering. And maybe it's everywhere except where they engage. And maybe they don't even want to hear government say it. Maybe they want to hear each other say it. So could it be the way we are communicating that is causing this? Why am I going to believe what someone that I don't trust is saying anyway? So is there a communication thing whereby maybe somebody else should be the one communicating, or we break it down into their own network, so that if it's my friend telling me that there's a Shopee or there's an Empower, then maybe I will apply, as opposed to if it's one politician telling me.
I think what it is we need to engage tools. And when I say tools includes people. Now, you define what your audience is, and you will use the best approach to appeal to that audience. And I think that answers your question that you're asking. If I want to appeal to the youth, I'm not a youth, so I'm not going to be appealing to them. One, the way I dress, the way I talk, the slangs I use. Even at home, I say some things and my kids start to laugh, and they have no clue what I'm talking about. So what I would now need to do is engage someone who is in their circle to do the communication for me. I will communicate what I want to that person. And that's why in my team, for example, I have 3 different sets of media team that work to get information that I want to get out. I have a youth, I have a female, and I have an older citizen. So that way the appeal will be in a manner that will be received by the audience. If I try to communicate right now with Gen Zs, I don't even know who Gen Zs are. Who are Gen Zs? Tell me, who are Gen Zs? Because there are two slangs. I call them slangs. Because my generation will call them slang to describe people. For example, you have Gen Zs and then you have the something else. I think the ones born in the 70s.
Millennials.
The millennials are the ones born in the 2000s, right? Now, what would appeal to a Gen Z is different from what will appeal to a millennial. So definitely you have to use the right tool to get to them. And the best tool for Gen Zs and millennials is technology. So you get through to them through technology in appealing manners. Put things on YouTube. They will go there. But if you put it in Wikipedia, they may not go there.
Or the Guardian newspaper. I think that goes part of what the government must do especially when they're trying to reach out generally. If you want to be transparent, you can certainly be trying hard, but just not using the right sources, not using the right platforms. Councillor Oloko, how do we rebuild this trust? What strategies should we be employing so that data is more accessible, understandable, useful from your new experience over the last few years? How are we going to rebuild it? You've tasted both sides. Yes, you made it very clear that it's different cultures, and you also made it clear that yes, Nigeria cannot stay as it is. So then the next question that naturally springs to mind is, so what are we going to do? How do we rebuild it? What strategies do you recommend that we should employ? Please go ahead, sir.
So I'm just picking up from something Honorable Tolu said, really. And I think when we also talk about communication, I think perception is also quite pertinent, because when somebody just perceives that you're not performing, but that's not necessarily because of you. It's because there's a history of a track record of non-performance or very low performance, which is one of the things that therefore that needs to change regarding building trust, because there's a history or track record of low performance, which manifests itself in the quality of the infrastructure that's around and the enabling environment. The role of government, principally, apart from defending its borders, is also to provide an enabling environment. And where that is not happening, that will affect the level of trust. And which is why I use China as an example, and the high correlation between between trust in the government and what has been achieved for individuals in that place. So for us, we need to start, one of the things that needs to start happening in Nigeria is that there needs to be an increase in performance. Things need to start working, right? If you turn on the lights and there's light, people begin to think government is working. If you have good roads, people begin to believe government is working. So government should start to build a record of what it's supposed to do. And when it starts to do that, we will begin to see things change. And that is where I see, if you talk about strategy, I would say performance. Here in the UK, what has happened, and why people have lost, why there's low trust in government, is because there's been a high level of performance.
Okay, Councillor Oloko, I would have wanted him to use something like procurement. The question was strategies that we should employ to make data more accessible, understandable, and useful. And you were talking about performance, but I wanted you to maybe talk to us about the procurement system.
Sorry, I missed the bit about data. I
was saying that
bit about data.
Yes, I was saying that you were talking about performance being one of the ways to one of the strategies to employ to ensure that people start trusting government, people will start rebuilding trust. But I want you to maybe use the procurement system in the UK. People always believe contract is only for people know. And if you're going to talk about transparency, contract is one place people will immediately jump at, that government is not transparent in procurement, in want to buy things. The law says they must advertise, but then, you know, even then we still believe it's not transparent. So maybe you want to help us with the system over there. How is the procurement system, and how does that build trust, or is it just the same? Are we all in the same kettle and we just get used to it?
So when I talk about fundamental, I don't think we're far apart as far as fundamentals goes. Now, my favorite phrase is what I call the illusion of.
You are well aware of our procurement processes, and I mean, as a politician myself, I know the stereotypes we face as people trying to do good and just don't believe you anyway. But how do we rebuild this trust? You know, Councillor Oloko was talking about performance, but you know, it's almost like the chicken and egg, almost like chicken and egg. But at what point how quickly can you perform for people to start to believe you? What are the strategies we're going to employ? And, you know, the one I know people accuse governments of very quickly is the procurement process. So are there measures we can implement to kind of build this trust back, so that people believe, you know, and it's like when you tell people pay your tax, and they're like, pay which tax? How can I pay tax? Why should I pay tax? They've not done anything. Why should I pay the tax? But they've not done anything doesn't mean you should not pay your tax, so to say. So anyway, what do you think, man?
You see, the procurement process is one that is very delicate across the world. Now, you go through all the paperwork, you make all the submissions, and then at the end of the day, someone sits at a desk and decides who gets the job, whether or not that person is the best for the job. That is the distrust in the procurement process. How do you get rid of that? Boils down to accountability. Boils down to character. For example, a man could be at the desk that's supposed to go through this analysis, and then he has already told his friend who lives down the road everything to submit to make him the best. The process will be transparent to everybody else, but one person already has an undue advantage. You know, President Trump, the US. So this is not unique to Nigeria. The only way that can go away, if we, the people, decide to have more integrity. It's all about integrity. The person in charge of the desk, does he have integrity? The person he reports to or she reports to, does that person have integrity? Will they get in trouble for doing the right thing? Because sometimes people want to do the right thing, but they are afraid of doing the right thing because doing the right thing will get them into trouble. I have had that experience in my life. So how do we overcome that? We have to be able to work together collectively and decide that we want to have integrity and accountability. And that's the only way forward. Because if the junior man on the desk wants to do things properly and the boss decides that, no, I am not going to, what do you think is going to happen to that person, the junior person? Do you think he wants to lose his job? So really, that's a question that's baffling to me as well.
Yeah, it does make me ask though, Saudi Arabia, China, all these countries, I wonder what their procurement processes are like. I wonder if they advertise. I wonder.
You know the difference there? Should I share the difference with you?
Sure, with the audience.
Death. You know, in Yoruba, they'll say Iku. Death. When you know that what you did will mean death, you will think twice before you do it. But when you know what you're doing, someone bigger than the person who is trying to enforce integrity will come out and say, no, don't do it that way. There's a problem, but in Japan, in China, the level of integrity is so high, and the sanctions for bad behavior is fatal. Can we do that here in Nigeria? Remember, there was a time there was a government in this country that decided that everybody that got drugs into this country was going to be killed at barbecue. It was these same people of Nigeria that kicked against it, that is too harsh. So how can we win? When you are harsh, they say you are too harsh. There was a story somebody shared with me the other day, that a man, I think it was brother-in-law, stole from his farm. So in the morning, he tied him up. Who was it that shared that example? Was it one of you? Or some other conversation I was in? In the morning, they tied him up. And everybody was like, yeah, he deserves it. He's a thief. They all went to their farm. On their way back in the evening, he was still tied up. And then everybody now turned against the man of integrity that was trying to enforce a punishment. Isn't it too much? That is wickedness. So we, the people again, are the problem. You know, so for me, telling you that I know the solution to that question, I would be lying to you. I don't know the answer.
Thank you for your honesty and transparency. So there's something recurring in the box. I see technology a lot, and I want to ask the question: how can technology be leveraged to enhance this transparency and accountability? And you know, usually one of the things we don't recognize, we seem to talk about trust between government and the people, but there may be a bigger question to ask is between government and academia, between government and media. Government doesn't trust some media houses. Between government and civil society.
I don't do that.
Civil society want to protest for everything. They don't even want to dialogue, you know, between government and different places. So it's much more than just the citizens. Even within sectors, they don't trust each other, you know, and that's a bigger question to ask. But you know, let's talk about technology. How are we going to leverage technology? And I think maybe Honorable Sadipe started talking a little bit about that, but how are we going to leverage technology to enhance transparency and accountability and the open government system that we want to have?
The thing about technology is technology can reach a lot more people at the same time than picking up your phone and calling a few people up, going to a newsstand. But technology can reach out to millions at the same time. But the cost of technology is so high. Now, we have to ask ourselves, does our government have the resources to invest in technology at the rate that will get out there? For example, you go to a lot of rural areas. My constituency is both rural and urban. And in those rural areas, we don't even have electric power lines. So, and technology is driven by power. So how do those people in those type of areas get information when they cannot log on to the internet? And you notice something, that once the mobile phones came into Nigeria, the level of exposure of the man on the street increased tremendously. Back then, when I was younger, a mechanic had no clue what was going on in Abuja, or in no, Abuja didn't exist when I was young. In Sokoto. Then it took days to travel by rail, because my father was legal advisor in Nigerian Rail Corporation. So, and he would take all those railroad trips. And while he's on those railroad trips, you couldn't even talk to him. But look at today. We're all on the mobile phone. We're communicating. Right now, I am having this meeting on my phone. But for this to really roll out en masse and reach deeper in Nigeria, there needs to be some infrastructural backbone. Can that be a priority for our government right now? I doubt it. Because we have bigger issues to deal with as a nation, so our people don't go hungry. Such
a fantastic point you make. You know, a lot of times government thinks when they post something on X, or when they put it on channels, the whole world has heard, or the whole country has heard, and that's just the reality. We still use town criers in rural areas. We still use certain types of methods to get things out. So when you're talking about even being transparent And naturally people say use tech, use tech. The honest truth is, like Honorable Sadipe said, in some areas there, even radio, they need to charge the radio, and they don't have power to charge radio, let alone internet or WhatsApp or any of those things. And this is a harsh reality we face. So thank you so much. I also think maybe the point there being technology for the older generation might be a bit of a struggle, while for the younger generation they're naturals, and that in itself can cause a bit of a distinction. Honorable Councillor Oloko, you wanted to say something?
Yeah, I mean, firstly, I apologize because I was transitioning from inside the car to the home, so I think I lost quite a bit of the thread of what I was saying, because I don't think I finished on what I was saying about procurement, and when you asked that question. But let me pick up what we're saying about technology, and I think Honorable Tolu is quite right. I mean, power plays a significant part in technology, because technology is powered by power, if you like. So if you can't charge your phone, you can't go on the internet, etc. But one thing I want to say, though, about the role of technology is that even when it breeds transparency and it supports accountability, it does not necessarily build trust. And I think we may want to analyze that at different levels. Just because you have access to the information, just because I'm accountable, doesn't mean you trust what I do, because you don't know what my motives are, even though you can read it. Now, coming back to the UK, when we talked about procurement, if we all go back to the time of COVID, right, one of the issues that the government faced at the time was to do with the contracts for COVID, for PPE. Now, it is reported that a VIP process was set up, to pick up on something that Honorable Tolu mentioned. And that VIP process meant that it gave discretionary powers to certain individuals to be able to award contracts for PPE equipment. Now, and the end result of that was a lot of equipment was wasted, was abandoned, but because of the process and the systems here, the openness of the system, the accountability aspect of it, not necessarily the trust, all those individuals involved have been called. So there is an inquest going on at the moment around who did what and why during COVID. And even the former prime minister has been called, has been questioned to account for his behavior, his pattern, his decision making. And the output from that really is that you can't really, there's a lower level of trust, because these people had the powers at that time, and they did, and it's alleged that it was misapplied. So you can see that whilst technology plays a big part, because over here everything is advertised, but you have to be able to get to the notice board or get to the website for you to be able to access that information. You have to be able to have the equipment to be able to decipher that, to be able to be able to make your submission. But make no mistake about it, right? People do business with people they know. And if there's if people have built up track records of performance, coming back to what I mentioned, to what I talked about around performance, then you're most likely, interesting enough, I had a discussion with somebody today on procurement in this country, and he said one of the things he did was to break down what was the single source of suppliers which was being used in this big PLC, a listed company in the UK. And he reduced he increased the number of suppliers to 61, and brought everything to competitive tender. And he said it made him very unpopular. Why would it make him unpopular when he's trying to make the things as competitive as it is? So these things exist in different countries. The difference, though, is when I come back to what I said earlier, is about the illusion of process. So if I tell you that the process is there's a VIP lane, all you need to do is be in the VIP lane and you're eligible to be selected. That's the process. And if that's the basis for selecting you, well, you've been selected according to the process. In Nigeria, the way we do things is slightly different. I mean, we do have our process, but sometimes we already have the answer to the question. But that happens here as well. Sometimes they have the answer to the question. The only thing that happens, though, is, and Honorable Tolu mentioned it, if you misbehave, there's a serious price to pay. In some countries, the price is death. So when we now talk about strategies, right, there must be a price for bad behavior, and that price must be enforced. Now, there's a joke that goes around. It's probably not a joke. It's probably an anecdote that says that, Honorable Tolu, please don't be offended, that when people leave government, they prepare for AFCC.
Not me.
Now, you can read into that whatever you want to read into it. But if there's a perception that that is what happens, then that's the reality.
Been listening to the news in the past few weeks.
Your is loaded, Honorable Seyi. That
I'm just listening. But I think, Councillor Oloko, you've raised some very, very interesting points as well. And, at the start of this conversation, I'm sure most would have believed that because you're transparent and accountable means you will build trust. But from what we're hearing and have seen, just the fact you give people information doesn't mean they will trust you. And doesn't mean the more transparent you are, doesn't mean you're going to be seen as more trustworthy. For all you know, you can just be following process and be giving information, and you're not. And the second point, which is extremely important, is consequences, enforcing consequences, so that people know that regardless, I can get into trouble for this. So as we start to wrap up now, we're coming to the end of our show. I have 3 questions. I'll just throw them to you both, and we will end the call. Really has been very, very insightful conversation. There's a Namdi Nake, who is a good friend of mine. A question for Honorable Konde Sadipe says, should trust be the primary driver of the relationship between government and the people? Should it be the primary driver? I think that's the key word. Or are there more important factors that build trust? All right. And then Honorable Oloko, Councillor Oloko, Honorable Oloko too. It says, what is the role of media in building citizens' trust towards government? And then the last we'll take after those 2 questions. So Honorable Sadipe, please go ahead.
I mentioned a word earlier on, integrity, and I also touched on another one, accountability. If there's integrity and accountability, there will be trust. Because over time, that wants to trust will keep testing the system, and the system will not fail. But if you test the system the first time and the system fails, and you test the second time and the system fails, because there's lack of integrity and there's lack of accountability and efficiency, because sometimes it's not intentional, sometimes it's lack of efficiency. But if all those 3 ingredients are in place and you test 1, the system passes. You test 2, the system passes. Test 3, system passes. You stop testing because you expect the system to pass. So I think the key ingredients should be integrity, number 1, accountability, number 2, and efficiency, number 3. With all that present, there will be trust.
All right. It's interesting, though, that these are not criteria people check in politicians before they vote for them usually, but that's a different conversation.
Yes, we should have that conversation. I'm looking forward
we will bring back a party system and what the parties probably need to do more to ensure we're putting forward the type of representatives that will lead to the type of country we want. Councillor Oloko, do you want to talk to us about media and government and trust, building trust?
Yeah. And just to add to what Honorable Tolu said as well, is that, look, if you do what you say you're going to do, people start to trust you. And I think that's one of the challenges we've had in the UK is that people perceive that the government has not done what it said it would do, and people's life has been disadvantaged. That's the perception of that. So do what you say you're going to do, which comes back to performance. Now, the role of media in building, I honestly would like to separate transparency, accountability, and trust, because I don't necessarily agree that transparency plus accountability builds trust. I think what builds trust is simply, like Honorable Tolu has said, is do what you say you're going to do. And as long as you keep doing that, people will believe you. Now, the role of media is to ensure that when you say you're going to do something, you do it. So media holds you accountable to your performance. And to the extent that media is allowed to be free, and media do what they're supposed to do, and media also includes social media, by the way. And social media is truly democratic. I mean, if you go onto Twitter sometimes, the the kind of the responses that you get on Twitter, is really mind-boggling. And people say exactly what is on their mind. But the role of media is quite critical, be it TV, social media, radio, whichever medium that you want to talk about. That their role is critical to hold government accountable. Now, holding them accountable does not necessarily means that builds trust, because holding them accountable could expose the level of mistrust as well. So I think I would say trust will be earned when you do what you say you will do. The role of media is to ensure that you do that, and if you don't do that, to be able to explain why you have not done it. And I think, and that's where the trick is to be able to hold somebody accountable, and that means you have to be informed. So media has to be informed, and sometimes you read headlines and the content is totally different from the headlines. So I mean, one has to be very careful what one says
So,
about media,
so,
because we can be held accountable in that regard, and this
so,
is
so,
recorded.
so is it that they are not informed or they're playing a card? Because I know, obviously, in America, if you watch Fox, they'll say you're Republican. If you watch CNN, they'll say you're Democrat. If you watch Rise, they'll say you're anti the ruling party. If you watch TVC, you're for the ruling party. And this is the media that's supposed to be independent. And then it goes back to who is bankrolling the media houses and who is holding all of those powers, those strings to make things happen. I guess it's another question entirely.
It's a discussion for another day.
Another day, absolutely.
You are now talking about the role of the application of media. And media influence are very strong influencers. They can influence, they do influence the outcome of results, which is why government or politicians or they seek to try and control and administer the kind of information that comes out through the different channels. But I think that's a different discussion.
It's a different conversation, absolutely.
Yes. Yeah.
I think what I've heard both of you say is that trust is an attitude towards trustworthiness. People, you get trust when you are trustworthy. You get trust not because you're transparent. You get trust not because you are even accountable, so to say. You get trust because you're trustworthy, and people build trust. And so you may give all the open data, you may give all the access, you may do all of those things, and yet still not be trustworthy enough to build trust. I think at this time we really should thank both of you for our time. I'm now starting to see more questions come in, but I think our time is really fast spent. Thank you so very much, Councillor Biyi Oloko, gentleman that has traversed the Nigerian government space and now the councillor in the United Kingdom, and our very own dear Honorable Tolu Akande Sadipe, a blazing trailblazer in the House of Representatives doing amazing work. You should listen to her speak anywhere. You will change your mind about politicians, I guarantee you. And I hope she's done a bit of that to us in our conversation this evening. So I just really want to say thank you on behalf of the African Governance Institute for Development. Thank you for joining all our guests. Please, if you haven't done so before, follow us on our social media pages, Instagram, YouTube, LinkedIn, Twitter, TikTok, you name it, we're there. Our next webinar will be on the last Thursday of the month of May. I think we'll be going into participation this time. So, and it promises to be exciting. It promises to be something that you will enjoy. So once again, Councillor Biyi, Oloko, Honorable Tolu, Akande, Sadipe, I am grateful. And on behalf of the entire team at African Governance Institute for Development, we thank you for your time. And we say, have a good evening. To all our guests, thank you for joining. Thank you for your time. And we look forward to continuing the conversation over the next month. Thank you and God bless.
Thank you very much.